Even after countless books on the couple, the questions remain. Was Mountbatten one of the outstanding leaders of his generation, or a man over-promoted because of his royal birth, high-level connections, film star looks, and ruthless self-promotion? What is the true story behind controversies such as the Dieppe Raid and Indian Partition and the love affair between Edwina and Nehru? The authorized biographies had certain subjects they had to cover and to avoid. Now 30 years later, with many of those involved in the story dead, with new papers released and different sensitivities, there is a case for a new book. The interesting biography will be the one that is published in 30 or 40 years' time when the dust has settled, wrote Mountbatten's military assistant, Pat McClellan, to Brian Kimmins, a wartime member of Dickey's staff in 1980. This book is that attempt. Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we are starting our brand new book, Onward and Upwards. We had a selection of 3 books, and it was The Mountbattens, and it was a book about Princess Margaret, and there's another book about RFK Jr. Overwhelmingly, we did not choose the RFK book. Sorry, you guys, who wanted it? I know some of you are ready to move on from the royals. But the 2 contenders that were going neck and neck the whole time were the Mountbatten book and the book on Princess Margaret. But Mountbattens won. So we're going to read this one, and then we'll read the Princess Margaret book, because I don't know that much about Princess Margaret, so I would really like to know more about her. But Andrew Loney's friend of the channel, and we love him. And we love his books, and we love the quality of his writing. We love is how much of the book is purely bibliography, sources, and notes on what he had to say and why he had to say it. So we love him. So I'm super excited about this book. I want to dive right in. If you are new to the channel, we have a whole series of books that we have done, deep dives into, deep reviews. We've done Spare, we've done Revenge. I'm really excited to read this particular book because Dickie Mountbatten comes up in everything I read. Everything. I mean, I don't know how that guy was everywhere all at once, and he knew everyone. And I just kept thinking, I need to know more about this guy because he's so integral in the stories of so many of the people we've already discussed on this channel. And interestingly, even just in other things that I've been reading recently, just other histories and stuff I've been reading, his name keeps coming up. So I am super interested to find out this guy's life story. Also, I love the fact that this book is not just about Dickie Mountbatten, but also about his wife, Edwina. She was a extremely interesting person of her own and in her own right. So we have lots to talk about there. She got around, Edwina did, so we got lots to discuss. I'm going to be reading the preface, the prologue, and the first chapter today. So we've got lots to get into. Let's settle down, get that cup of tea, get yourself a snack. Let's go. All right. This book begins, the preface begins like this. And just as another side note, another thing I love about Mr. Loney is that he is an incredibly detailed and intellectual writer, and yet he's so accessible to the reader. You're reading these dense histories, but he makes them like page turners. I don't know how he does it, but anyway, here's the preface. Writing to Richard Hough about how he would like to be acknowledged in Hough's book, Louis and Victoria, Dickie Mountbatten suggested, naval officer who became First Sea Lord after being Supreme Allied Commander and Viceroy of India, and thus the best-known figure the Navy has produced since Nelson, as well as being the president of the Society of Genealogists. The entry reveals much. Mountbatten's achievements, what he valued, and his pomposity. No figure has a longer entry in Who's Who, apart from Winston Churchill, partly because every minor organization is mentioned, but also because Dickie Mountbatten had a remarkable life. As one obituary noted, it seemed almost unbelievable that one human being could have touched the history of our century at so many points. Here, that's the thing I can't believe. How was he everywhere all the time? Head of Combined Operations, a member of the Chiefs of Staff, and then Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Southeast Asia during the Second World War, the last Viceroy and first Governor-General of India, First Sea Lord, and Chief of the Defense Staff, member of the royal family and mentor of Prince Philip and Prince Charles. His life, which covered the first 80 years of the 20th century, also provides an opportunity to look at some of the most important and controversial issues of the period, from the 1942 Dieppe Raid to Indian independence. His biography cannot be told without also considering the life of his wife, Edwina, the richest heiress in the world when they married, whose reputation for her global humanitarian work endures. Philip Ziegler's magisterial official life of Dickey was published in 1985, and Janet Morgan's deft authorized life of Edwina came out 6 years later. What is missing is a shorter joint biography of these two remarkable figures, a book which is also a portrait of an unusual marriage, one that was loving and mutually supportive, but also beset with infidelities. As Dickey would later claim, Edwina and I spent all our married lives getting into other people's beds. Starting off on a high note here. With the Mountbattens, the private life did intrude into the public life, not least in the question over the nature of the relationship between Edwina and the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and how far it affected the perception of the impartiality of the Mountbattens during independence. Even after countless books on the couple, the questions remain. Was Mountbatten one of the outstanding leaders of his generation, or a man over-promoted because of his royal birth, high-level connections, film star looks, and ruthless self-promotion? What is the true story behind controversies such as the diaper raid and Indian partition and the love affair between Edwina and Nehru? The authorized biographies had certain subjects they had to cover and to avoid. Now 30 years later, with many of those involved in the story dead, with new papers released and different sensitivities, there is a case for a new book. The interesting biography will be the one that is published in 30 or 40 years' time when the dust has settled, wrote Mountbatten's military assistant Pat McClellan to Brian Kimmins, a wartime member of Dickey's staff in 1980. This book is that attempt. Ooh, he's always leaving us with those great one-liners at the end of a thing. So that's a preface. Now let's do the prologue. All right, so it opens on the wedding day, right? So there's 600 people gathered for the wedding of Edwina and Dickey, and it was at St. Margaret's, the 12th century church in the shadow of Westminster, which was, I suppose, a favorite for society weddings. The Daily Telegraph said it was the wedding of the year. The Star said it was the wedding of the century. And it was between beautiful Edwina Ashley, the richest girl in the world, and Lord Louis Mountbatten, the handsome naval officer and member of the extended royal family. King George V and Queen Mary and most of the royal family were in attendance. And the Prince of Wales, later to be Edward VIII, was the best man. So a star-studded event, I must say. Now, the couple, Dickey at 6'2", dwarfing his wife, emerged from the church to Mendelssohn's Wedding March just as the sun broke through the rain, and they walked under the traditional arch of swords of a naval guard of honor. Mountbatten, his sharp, chiseled face set in a solemn expression, was dressed in a long blue frock coat and golden epaulets, in the dress uniform of the naval lieutenant, and carrying his father's gold-hilted sword. Edwina, blue-eyed and fair-haired, was in a simple ankle-length frosted silver dress with a wreath of orange blossom on her head and a 4-foot train of silver cloth covered with 15th century lace. Ooh, the indulgence. Don't you just love descriptions of things? I mean, it all just sounds so elegant. Frosted silver, wreath of orange blossoms, 15th century lace. I just love the sound of words of beautiful things. Sometimes the words of beautiful things are more beautiful than the things themselves. What I do find funny is this next description, which, if it wasn't full of, the names of fancy things, it would sound rather odd. So they climbed into a bridal car, which was a Rolls Royce. This was a wedding present that Edwina had bought from the Prince of Wales. And rather than drive the car around, it was sort of towed by a naval gun crew around Parliament Square. And then around the corner, a flag-draped lorry took over and net towed the car past Buckingham Palace to the reception at the bride's home. There at the entrance to the 2 ground-floor reception rooms, where a narrow dividing room had been made into an avenue of 10-foot orange trees, the couple received their 800 guests. Now, so large was this wedding cake that it took 4 men to haul it to its position. And it was adorned with a crown and miniature anchors and sails and tiny lifeboats all hanging off of the cake. Interesting theme. I mean, he was in the Navy, so I understand it, but resplendent. The wedding had attracted attention around the world with entire issues of magazines devoted to it. And one of the features in the Times magazine was a list of all the presents that Edwina had received. Very interesting. She'd received a pendant with the royal cipher and diamonds from Queen Alexandra. She had received a brooch from the Aga Khan, a horse from the Maharaja of Jaipur, and what's really odd is she also received as a wedding present the bracelet she had only just recently returned to a previous suitor named Gordy, who was the Duke of Sutherland. How did the bracelet come back to be a present? Did she give it back to him and he was like, no, I want you to have it. I'll send it back to you as a wedding present? Or did he sell the bracelet and then somebody else bought it and sent it to her? I don't know, but that's weird. Anyway, Mountbattens' gifts were more practical. He got a ship's telescope, copper hot water jug, barometer. Interesting. And then, of course, from the king, he was awarded Knight Commander Victorian Order to add to his cherished Japanese Order of the Rising Sun and the Grand Cross Order of the Nile. Finally, at 5 p.m., they set off in the Rolls Royce for the bride's family home, Broadlands, to begin their married life together. So, that's how things began. But where did they begin? Who were these people? You know, what was their story and what was their start? So this first chapter is really bringing us to the very beginning, to the birth of both of these people. Most of the chapter is dedicated to Dickie. The rest of it is dedicated to Edwina. The author writes that Dickie Mountbatten was born on June 25th, 1900, at Frogmore House. And he was a great-grandson and godson of Queen Victoria. His mother, Victoria, born in 1863, was the daughter of the Queen's second daughter, Alice. Dickie's mother was to be an important influence, encouraging in her youngest child supreme self-confidence and acting as his tutor between the ages of 5 and 10. She taught me English, German, French, and Latin. She taught me world history in a horizontal manner, he later recalled. In the Elizabethan era, I knew what was going on in Europe and India, as well as in England. And truly, the family was so well connected across Europe that it wouldn't have been difficult to understand the history going on because you also knew many of the major players, so it would have been of greater interest to you had you been in his position. Now, he was christened Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas, but he was always known as Dickie, sometimes spelled with a Y, sometimes spelled with an I-E. His father, Prince Louis, born in 1854 in Austria, was the son of Prince Alexander and Princess Julie of Hesse, the oldest ruling Protestant dynasty in the world. But, as it was a morganatic marriage, the children were excluded from the succession to the sovereignty of Hesse. This genealogical flaw in Mountbatten's ascendance was to be an embarrassment, which he would seek to brush over in later life. Dickie's father had joined the Royal Navy, aged 14, and enjoyed a successful naval career, becoming Director of Naval Intelligence shortly after his younger son's birth. Part of the slightly louche set around Edward VII, his torso boasted a tattoo of a dragon. In 1881, he had fathered a child, Jean Marie, with the king's mistress, Lily Langtry. So Dickie's dad was pretty wild in his own right, you know. That is bold to go ahead and have a child out of wedlock, not with anybody, but with the king's own mistress. Whoa, man. Zip those pants up. Find something else to do. In 1884, Prince Louis had married his cousin Victoria, eldest daughter of the Grand Duke Louis of Hesse, and a favorite granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and their children, Alice, Louis, and George, were born respectively in 1885, 1889, and 1892. Fluent in French and German, a skilled pianist and artist who had been elected to the Royal Institute of Painters and Watercolors, he was worshipped by his youngest child. As the youngest, and with a gap of between 15 and 8 years with his siblings, Dickie was used to amusing himself and getting his own way. He later recollected, I was spoilt, and no one minded. I think people probably did mind. It seemed too much of a trouble to fix the issue, so better just let you continue to have your way. His was an essentially female household, as his brother and father were seldom at home, where he was doted on by his mother, 2 elder sisters, and various female members of staff. This was to have a powerful effect on him later in life. He was always to get on with women better than men, who were either to be admired, like his father and brother, or seen as antagonists to be defeated. It was also a much more cosmopolitan upbringing than that enjoyed by most British children of the time. Just after his first birthday, he had stayed with the Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, the governor of Moscow, before going on to the Peterhof Palace. And for Christmas, when he was 5 years old, he received from the Tsar, who was married to Dickie's aunt, a replica uniform of the Crack Chevalier Guard, complete with helmet, breastplate, boots, spurs, and sword. No telling what that cost to have made for a 5-year-old. It was to be the start of a lifelong love of uniforms for Dickie. Now, I was astounded because recently I had just been reading about the assassination of Rasputin, and little did I know that Dickie Mountbatten was related to those involved in the assassination. The book goes on to say that Dickey spent the summer of 1908 with various Russian relations, where, at the Nicholas Palace in St. Petersburg, he became friendly with his cousin, the Grand Duke Dmitri, one of the two conspirators behind the death of Rasputin. Is there anyone that Dickey doesn't know or isn't related to? This was followed by a week with Tsar Nicholas and his family at the Petrov Palace. Now, the time had come for him to enter his real studies. No more living under the tutor of mother, boarding school. And his parents picked Lockers Park, a fashionable prep school just north of London, with strong naval connections, which Dickey's cousin Maurice and brother George had attended a few years previously. Now, of course, you can't enter into a boarding school and remain unmaimed, so he begins being attacked immediately. They like to make fun of his name. He wrote to his mother and said, "Some of my nicknames are Batter Pudding, two things beginning with P, Prince, and Pig, also London Fire Brigade like LFB. One boy spelt my name Battenberg." Okay, you'll help me figure this out, because I don't understand this. Was his name always Mountbatten, or was it Battenberg before? Is the joke that his friend is playing on him, was he Germanizing Mountbatten by saying Battenberg? Berg being mountain in German. Or was their name Battenberg, and then they changed it to Mountbatten to sort of anglify the last name when there was so much aggression towards Germans? I'm not sure. He doesn't say it, but then was it just a joke? Because the way the boy spelled his name was Batumberg. Was the joke that he turned Mountbatten into a German, like the German form of it? Or was the joke that he just didn't spell his last name correctly? I don't know. Regardless, how did he do at school? What was his deal in school? Well, it would seem that he faced school the way a person would face a marathon. He kind of slogged through it at first, slow, sort of at the bottom of his class. But then at the end of every term, he'd be like number one in the class. And this happened repeatedly. It was almost like a pattern with him. He was a friendly student, kind, and he was popular. One contemporary, Sir Hamilton Kerr, later remembered how, when he was lonely and miserable at the school, he discovered that Mountbatten could speak German. We talked German on Sunday afternoons, walking up and down the school lawn. One never forgets these kindnesses of early youth, says Sir Hamilton in remembrance. Now, was he athletic? No. Not naturally, but he did manage to reach the finals of the boxing competition and captain the second football team. Above all, his qualities of leadership were beginning to be recognized, and he became a prefect. His headmaster wrote of him that he always acted on the principle that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing well. The headmaster went on to say that we all regret that his stay at the school has come to an end, and I am confident of his future success. Because, of course, it's time to move on to college, and his parents chose for him to go to Osborne, the Navy's training school on the Isle of Wight, passing in 15th out of the 83 cadets. Now, if he thought he'd been ill-used at Lockers Park even slightly, Osborne was very different. The 430 boys, many from naval families, were subject to naval discipline. And instead of school uniforms, they wore naval dress, ranging from monkey jackets to dress uniforms for special occasions. The curriculum was focused on subjects such as engineering, navigation, and seamanship, and it was a tough environment aimed at developing self-discipline, initiative, and confidence. There was a lot of bullying, and Dickey, cocky and feminine-looking, was frequently bullied. In May, he got into a fight with a boy who had been at Lockers Park, John Scott, who teased him about his name. And because he was willing to stand up to John Scott, he earned the respect of his peers when he fought back. Academically, he was still doing well. His tutor wrote that he made an excellent start. He said he invariably shows great keenness in everything and is always out to learn. And by the next term, his teacher had written that he possesses the gift of thoroughly mastering a subject before he allows himself to pass on. This was to prove a characteristic throughout his life. So determined is what he is. Now, what of his free time? The summer of 1913 was spent in Hesse with his older siblings. Of course, it's lovely that he was born in 1900 because it's easy to keep track of his age. He's 13 at the time. The summer of 1913 was spent in Hesse with his older siblings. Alice, who was now married to Prince Andrew of Greece, Louis and George. George was now a lieutenant on the battlecruiser HMS New Zealand. They were joined in Hesse by the Tsar and Tsarina and their 5 children. The Tsar and Tsarina and their 5 children. One of whom was this 14-year-old Marie who Dickey fell madly in love with. He said, I was crackers about Marie. And he said she was absolutely lovely. I keep her photograph on the mantelpiece in my bedroom. I always have. Unfortunately, within 5 years, all the family would be dead at the hand of the Bolsheviks. Isn't that crazy? That you would vacation with these people and then 5 years later they're all slaughtered? Dickie would have been 18, so you can imagine his dismay that Marie, who he had had such fondness for, would be dead. Of course, he'd be dismayed about any of it, but, particularly since he had such a thing for her. Now, the following year, after he goes on vacation in Hesse with the Tsar and Tsarina and all their kids, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and of course the war is on. Prince Louis, his father, had become First Sea Lord in 1912, and Dickie was invited to watch a full test mobilization of the fleet on July 18th. Dickie was thrilled to watch the Royal Review at Spithead in front of King George V with the full might of the Royal Navy laid out in front, some 59 battleships, 55 cruisers, 78 destroyers, 16 submarines, and a host of lesser craft, and to meet Admiral Jellicoe and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Dickie had met Churchill before. He didn't think much of him, because Churchill had come to Osborne, and he asked the cadets if they had any requests. Dickie was the first one to speak up, and he said, yes, sir. Would it be possible for us to have 3 sardines on Saturday night's dinner instead of just the 2 sardines that were given? And Winston Churchill said he'd see about it, but the sardines were not forthcoming. It was a lesson that Dickie would remember, and he didn't care for that. What about that 3rd sardine, man? It was Prince Louis alone on duty on the fateful Friday before the outbreak of war who had to make the decision not to stand down the fleet, but keep them mobilized. It proved to be a wise decision. The following day, Germany and Russia declared war on each other, and on August 4th, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Now, his father should have continued to go on to have an illustrious career. He's a very talented man, and he had risen to the ranks, and he had worked hard. And he was First Sea Lord. But when a country decides to declare war on another country, and in this case, England declaring war on Germany, a very nasty thing can happen in that suddenly there's all this anti-German feeling. And it seems very hard for people to differentiate that there are actions of war that you can find deplorable, but the people themselves of that country aren't at fault for the actions of their leaders. And so, as recently as the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine, when that broke out, there was this odd strain of hatred toward anything Russian, even now, even in this day and age, when you would think that we would be able to differentiate the nuance between a government making a poor choice and the people and the culture and the customs. And then, there was all of this cancellation of anything Russian. It was very disgusting and sickening. But of course, the same thing was seen, and to a much higher degree at this time when England had decided to declare war against Germany. Well, with Prince Louis's background, having been born in Austria, and because he spoke German and because of his relations and all of this, it became a major distraction to the efforts that he was trying to put forth. The author goes on to describe this. He says, there was an almost instant wave of anti-German feeling with assaults on suspected Germans. Even dachshunds were targeted. How are you going to go after somebody's German dog? And the looting of stores owned by people with German-sounding names. Mountbatten initially joked to his mother on August 14th that Papa has turned out to be a genuine spy and has been discreetly marched off to the tower where he's guarded by beefeaters. I got rather a rotten time of it for about 3 days as little fools like Stopsford insisted on calling me German spy and kept on heckling me and trying to make things unpleasant for me. In October, the German-accented Prince Louis, feeling that the criticisms of him as head of the Navy were a distraction from the war effort, resigned as First Sea Lord. He had faithfully served his adopted country for 46 years, and yet Winston Churchill made no attempt to dissuade him. His son was devastated. Another cadet saw a contemporary standing in front of the Osborne mast with tears running down his cheeks. It was Dickie. From that day, he was to have one consuming ambition, to avenge his father's dismissal and become First Sea Lord himself. Poor guy, what a devastation, because it's his whole life has been sort of in the shadow of his dad, but he didn't mind standing there in the shadow of his dad. And I've seen, 46 years in service to the Navy, and because he had a German accent, it was becoming so distracting that he resigned his post. What a unearned humiliation. I don't blame Dickie for being I will avenge, And of course, as a young, ambitious person, as much as I'm sure he resented the fact that this has happened to his dad, it gives him a very clear mission and goal in life, So I'm sure there was a part of him that hated it and a part of him that loved having so clear a path to follow. Now, what of Edwina? Let's discuss her. Now, this was shocking to me. I had no idea. Did you know that Edwina is a descendant of the Native American princess Pocahontas? The Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, and the reformer and philanthropist, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, Edwina was born November 28, 1901. Her father, Wilfred Ashley, was a former colonel in the Grenadier Guards, who would later become a conservative member of the Parliament. Now, and her maternal grandfather was the banker, Sir Ernest Cassel, financial advisor to Edward VII. The king was Edwina's godfather. She was named after him. And her grandfather was one of the richest men in the world. Now, her grandfather, Cassel, whose wife had died within 3 years of marriage, was very close to his only child and her firstborn daughter, and provided one of the few anchors in Edwina's rather rootless youth. Edwina's father was a remote figure, busy pursuing his parliamentary business or sporting interests. And her mother, Maud, frequently ill, had no idea how to be a parent to Edwina. Maud died of tuberculosis in February 1911 when Edwina was 9 and her sister Mary was 5. Neither child was allowed to attend the funeral at Romsey Abbey. Edwina wrote to her father, "I am so very sorry darling Mama left us all so suddenly and forever. I wanted to kiss her once and now I didn't. But it's very nice to think her spirit will always be with me." She never spoke of her mother again in public. How sad. Now, both daughters found it hard to come to terms with their mother's death, but both of them dealt with it very differently. Edwina, who was forced to grow up very quickly, became neater and more dutiful and tried to mind her P's and Q's, the way a firstborn often does. But Mary, the younger, responded by being willful and uncooperative, difficult. Edwina poured her love into caring for her animals, puppies, ponies, rabbits, kittens, a goat, a present from her grandfather, an Arab horse. Quite the gift. Educated at home, she was a conscientious and organized student who by the age of 10 could read German, write in French, and play the piano. She had a particular love for geography, noted one biographer. Maps fascinated her. Talk of distant lands gripped her attention, and she would read travel books voraciously. But then, we need a maternal spirit here, right? Somebody's got to take care of these children. So the situation improved dramatically with the arrival of a new governess, Laura Deveria, in September 1912. Young, warm-hearted, and fun, she made lessons interesting, and the two girls adored her. But their happiness did not last long. No. Wilfred, the father, was lonely, and of course he needs companionship also, and he needed a wife for his political career, so he remarried. Unfortunately, his choice was less than impressive. He met Molly Forbes Semple on the political circuit. And Molly was completely inept at the life that she was now going to lead. But they married weeks after she had secured a divorce from her naval officer husband. She quickly made herself unpopular with everyone through her bossiness and sensitivity in attempts to make changes, from replacing the brocade wall coverings at the family home in Hampshire Broadlands to strict new rules that the children should be sent to bed at 6:30. Lady, you just got here. What are you sending the kids to bed at 6:30? 6:30? Yeah, that would have been real unpopular. A guest who came back early from fishing because of the rain was made to eat his lunch in the hall rather than bring his wet boots into the dining room. What in the world? The audacity, the rudeness. Would it be so hard to get a cloth to wipe up that wet? She insisted the girls call her Madre. Oh, Madre. And when traveling by train, she would go first class but put them in third. Yeah, you couldn't write a meaner. What a horrific stepmother. But it gets worse because she dismissed Laura Deveria, the governess. She regarded her as a threat, and so she was dismissed. And of course, that increased the girls' unhappiness and sense of rejection. Wilfred, the weak-spined coward that he was, fearful of confrontation and busy raising and training a battalion to take to France, turned a blind eye rather than stand up for his daughters. What a jerk. The anti-German hysteria that affected the Battenbergs was now directed at the German-born Ernest Cassel. In spite of being one of the largest subscribers to the war loan and entrusted with an official mission to the United States to secure a loan of $500,000, he was accused of being friendly with the German emperor and having a specially designed wireless set on the roof of Brooke House to maintain contact with the country of his birth. Sir George Macgill, secretary to the anti-German Union, brought a lawsuit to strip Cassel of his membership of the Privy Council. It failed. But for Edwina, like her future husband remembering his father's experiences, it was something she would never forget. And that is the end of that. But wasn't that a roaring start? I had heard in my comments numerous times that this was a book that I needed to look into because though it's all starting out fairly, good for our image of Dickie, it gets bad. He's accused of quite a number of things in this book. Philandering and carrying on with not just women, not just men, but some darker things are to be revealed as this book goes on. So I'm interested to know. I'm also interested in the wild behavior of Edwina that will be uncovered. She had quite a few lovers openly. And I find it very interesting that Dickie was willing to withstand that. I don't quite know. I mean, I guess maybe they just understood each other. Maybe it was a friendship that they were willing to sort of just put up with each other's folly and foolishness because they got along so well. And because they were both willing to sort of turn a blind eye, it all just worked out for them. Who knows? But I'm really interested to see the dynamic between these two. All right, that's it for this time, but I'll see you guys very soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to our new book, and big welcome to all of the new faces here. See you soon. Bye.